This is the Better Software Faster podcast, where we deep dive into the intersection of tech and business to demystify, unravel, and explore concepts that you can apply to your own organization. From pipelines to processes, forecasting to fine-tuning, best practices to balance sheets, we draw on all of our customer-facing experience to bring you the best high-level talking points. Hello and welcome to the Better Software Faster podcast episode 6. I'm your host, Adam Godwin. Joining me today once again are Miro, our CEO, and Amos, our COO. Gentlemen.
Hey.
Hello.
Hello. And today we're following our AI conversation that was incredibly downcast on all of the doom and gloom that future is going to bring us. We're going to continue the negativity by focusing on how to ruin an MVP, how to fail spectacularly, how to do everything wrong and blow your investment. And for better or worse, something you two gentlemen have some experience in. So I'm very happy to let you run with it. Where do you want to start? Where is the best jumping off point for how to ruin your MVP?
Fantastic. Well, I think the most usual one is not to have one in the first place, right? Ignore everything there is to ignore about MVPs and just try and build everything in the first instance, right? One sure way to fail spectacularly is to not think of what is it actually that your users need on a first iteration. What is actually the most minimal viable product, and just try and build everything, right? Come up with a proper wish list of everything that's nice to have and everything that you could have, and just try and build everything. That seems to be a very, very good way to fail. Not so fast, maybe, but at least fail spectacularly. What do you think, Ames?
Yeah, I completely agree. There's a lack of focus from day one. Whether it's that you haven't figured out what your ideal customer profile, your ICP is, or what it is that they might want to see or to use or to deliver. But also, where's your focus on those really key functions that you need to test the market for to see if this is actually what your customer wants, assuming you have even described who they are, right? So if you're not looking at those top 2 or top 3 feature functions, then you haven't got enough focus to build an MVP. And you're also letting it run away with yourself. Maybe you built the first 2 or 3 and you think, I just need 2 more. And then you build those 2 and you just need 12 more. And then all of a sudden your development team is busy going sprints to the wind, and you're 4 months down the road, you've deployed nothing, right? And you still have no real clear focus on what the outcome is going to be. It's a very, very easy place for people to get to, because MVP is a complex enough sport as it is. But if you incorporate that into a lean startup mentality, you've got some rails to go on. But people look at the MVP thing and go, well, it's just people won't buy it. People won't buy it. It's not the point, is it? You're not actually getting them to buy it. You're trying to prove your marketplace. Nobody's saying that you're going to go to market with an MVP and become a unicorn. That's not what it's about.
Absolutely. There's a nice extension there to the building for scalability, right? A good way to bleed away all the cash in the bank before getting a product out there is to actually start solving problems that you don't have, right? Build everything for the end state, build everything for the million users from day one, and you end up solving problems that you will never have, right? And that's a fantastic way of spending a lot of money with zero outputs.
Yeah, it is the absolute archetypal solution around build it and they will come, right? Does it Field of Dreams or something that was wrong?
Yeah.
But build it and they will come is absolute horseshit. It really is. It always has been. And so because you don't really know what you're building, it is, proper software deployment is thousands of iterations over a period of time. And the majority of those iterations are based upon feedback from your customer base. So if you don't have a customer base, you don't have anything to base your iterations on. So if you go and grow a brain and build something that's the size of a planet before anybody's actually used it, who are you to decide that that's actually what people are going to use or going to consume? It makes no rational sense whatsoever. but we've both seen it quite a lot. And actually, ironically, I've seen it more in corporate land than I have in startup. They're building this new team and this new department, and everything has to be done right. So because of that, 47 people are involved. There's no way you can do anything without 12 levels of sign-off. And they're building this massive, humongous thing with no clue whatsoever whether or not it's going to have any form of legs to continue running after they've built this proof of concept that is actually probably spending more than a dozen startups do in their MVPs. The concept's all the same. It's not specific to startup. It is for deployment per se. You know, we've seen a lot of it.
Absolutely, and that's a great take actually from the corporate world, because that is indeed the case, right? You know, if we aim to get an MVP out there in 12 weeks, you know, we've seen that take 12 years, right? You know, you lose all hints of velocity if you try to build something with a committee of people to sign everything off and ensure that you know, everyone's happy. That just doesn't work, right?
Yeah, and you know, it comes back to, oh, you're going to ruin the brand, or it's not secure, or we've got GDPR, we've got all kinds of other issues, and it just disappears into a mire of a dozen black holes, and then nobody. So all the good ideas get filtered down and watered out to something that is basically unachievable. And in some cases, politically, maybe that's what one or two individuals in the organization wanted, and they get that ultimately in the end. But I've seen on the other side, other organizations use Lean Startup as a separate independent way to get some of this stuff into skunkworks, as it's called, so they can actually start to deploy it in more small circles that's fully controlled, so they get a better idea of what works. And of course, they've got all the resources in the world in order to be able to do it. That's their great advantage compared to startups. There's no shortage of skilled people to support them and second into these projects. They just don't tend to look at them through the right lens. And so, to be honest, in most cases, any developers who are being pushed into these types of projects know they've failed before they've started, because they know they're going to be sitting into 15 or 20 meetings that they're just never going to get that time back from. It's not going to go anywhere.
Indeed. And yeah, you know, we've seen that work fantastically, where you build like a skunkworks approach inside a larger enterprise. You know, you empower a team to actually make a dent, right? You know, this is your sandbox, this is your autonomous sandbox. Go and make shit happen, right? But, you know, turning that again on its head, a great way to fail in that is not to give them the autonomy, right? You know, you can build whatever you want. Just make sure that it's signed off by legal, by marketing, by the SLT, by the EMT, by everyone, right? Before you show it to anyone. You know, that's a great way of then again getting bound down by the million layers of bureaucracy that exists by default.
And you know, it was a great example of a corporate that actually gets that right, and it's Google. Google, a very long time ago, I'm not sure if it's still the same, but certainly had a mentality where they had a maximum of 4 people in a software development team. So they have tens of thousands of developers now, but my understanding is that they're running groups maximum 4, but typically 3. And then once a month, everybody gets the opportunity to build stuff that they want to build, anything they want to build, whenever they want. But the only constraint is that it must be enhancing something that they have at the moment, or be a brand new idea based around some of Google's existing products, right? And a whole raft of new innovations came out of that actually ended up into full-term deployment, because people had that autonomy that Miro was talking about, but they were just spending a few hours on a Friday afternoon once a month coding up something that was running around in the back of their minds. And then every couple of months, they had a show and tell, and some of this stuff was amazing, as you would expect it to be. And guess what? They picked it up, ruggedized it, pushed it out, and a lot of that stuff is still in play today. And I know news.google.com was one of those, right? And there's loads and loads and loads and loads of examples where that can happen and where it can work, but it takes a mentality and an empowerment to let people go and do it.
Indeed. One thing I wanted to pick up that you said earlier around if you build it, they'll come. That is very relevant to the startup world is the lack of marketing, right? We see this especially in the more technology-led startups where the core expertise is actually building or engineering products, right? And there seems to be a perception that if your product is good enough, people will just start using it, right? If you build it, if it's spectacular, they'll just use it, right? You don't need to market, you don't need to tell anyone, they'll just show up, right? When we get our first user, I'm sure we'll get the next 10 automatically, right? And that might happen once in a million cases, right? There are examples when that has happened, right? But I think just ignoring marketing and concentrating on building a fantastic product is also a brilliant way to fail spectacularly. What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, if you don't have a clear understanding of what your your market demographic is, and B, what your route to market is, you've already failed. It doesn't matter how good your product is, and let's assume that you haven't overspent on the development of it. You've created a fit for purpose MVP. If you can't get it into a space where people will see and understand what the product is, you're not going to get the feedback in order to be able to iterate it, even if people do buy it, right? So it's the two things absolutely go hand in hand, and it's a massive mistake not to have a really clear marketing strategy, even for the short term, around your MVP to get it out there. And again, I know I keep referring to lean startup, but these things go hand in hand. It's a well-worn path. It makes a lot of sense. You've got to get out of the office. You've got to talk to people. You've got to get feedback. And what Miro was talking about there about the 1 in a million that works. This is where something goes viral, but nobody knows how to make something go viral. It just happens, right? And if you're lucky enough to be in a position where your application or whatever it might be goes viral, great. That doesn't prove you're a great marketeer. It just proves that you're lucky, right? And if you try and do something again the next time and expect that to happen, I guarantee you it won't work. So I think that the marketing piece is absolutely critical, because it also proves to you that you can explain and provide value about your application into the marketplace, and you also understand who you're competing with because you've checked it out.
I think that goes hand in hand with what you were saying before about really just focusing on that core, right? Knowing your market, knowing your ICP, and knowing those 3 or 4 core features that need to comprise the base of the product. If you're building and building and building on top and you're steadily losing focus, it also then becomes harder for you to means test that against your core audience, because you're broadening your message and broadening your audience.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that there's a mindset for the product designer in an MVP, which is that level of pride and a certain amount of ego that says if your application is going out, maybe it doesn't have the best UI UX in the world, and there's a whole lot of features I want to add. There's a backlog 15 feet long. But this is an MVP, so I've got to do it. There's a really difficult pull and push saying, stop, let it go, see what the feedback is, because there's a little bit of ego. This is representing me, it could be so much better, but that's not the point of why you're doing it. The point is to see, would anybody be any way interested in the raw feature functions that you think are the base concept of this product, And this is also why many of the top class solutions we've seen out there today have pivoted, because the answer was no. They're not interested in the core product and solution that you're offering, but they are interested in a fragment of something else that turns out to be a unicorn, right? How are you ever going to get to that point if you build an entire product first, expect people to come, and then find out that they don't want to buy it? Because the small fragment that you're trying to expose is now hidden around 200 other features that nobody's interested in. So there's loads and loads of benefits in doing it differently.
There's a good phrase that I read somewhere around when you launch your MVP, if you're not at least a bit embarrassed on what you're launching too late, right? So I think that kind of reflects the mentality quite well. But something that goes hand in hand with what you just said, Amos, and this might be a bit of a hot take, but one good way to fail in this regard is to try and solve all the difficult problems up front, right? We were big fans of failing fast, right? Trying to ensure that the things that absolutely need to be solved should come up front, because otherwise, if you end up building something and 18 months down the line you realize that actually this doesn't work because we can't solve this one problem, right? I think that has a lot of validity to it if you actually have a problem that is a game, it's a blocker, right? But at the end of it, not many challenges or problems are actually that severe, right? And a great way to end up spending all the money in the bank with no product is to actually try and solve all the difficult problems up front before going to market.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think the other thing about it is that if you have difficult problems to solve, it doesn't mean you can't solve them tactically and not strategically. There are easy ways to, the analogy of the duck swimming on the lake where it looks serene and all that, and the paddles are going 90 to the dozen under the water, is exactly what an MVP should look like, right? It's all veneer and little feature functionality behind it, underneath it. But what it does do is that if you, over a period of time, as you get closer and closer to these how people are using this software, not only will the shape of that problem absolutely change over that period of time, because user feedback changes your mindset about how these things work, you will also come up with probably 2 or 3 different ways to solve the same problem that you couldn't possibly have done on day one, irrespective of the fact that you didn't need to solve it then. And I want to go back to something else that you said a second ago. That piece about if you're not embarrassed about your MVP, then it's not an MVP. I completely agree with that. And I think MVP is not a software process. I think it's a psychology, right? I think you need to have a certain mindset to do an MVP, because I think you need to be able to divorce yourself from whether this thing that you're creating, that you thought of in the shower 3 years ago and now actually trying to bring to marketplace right now, whether it actually has value or not. Because if you don't divorce yourself from that and put yourself through the stress of doing an MVP and getting it out there and asking people to tell you what they think and be prepared for them to call your baby ugly, right? If you're not prepared to do that, right, then you don't have the right psychology to implement an MVP in the first place. And this is also why people want to polish it and polish it and polish it and polish it, because it'll be better. And if it's better, they won't say no. Well, you just want the truth, right? Because what people will then tell you, well, I didn't like this, but if it did this, that would be better, or I would like this. It's gold dust. It's absolute gold dust. It'll also make you feel better, but it's also true. And when you're looking at the fail fast thing, if it turns out that the answer is it's crashed and burned, it's dead, right? It's not worth doing, and you have no pivot from it. Well, the truth is you spent actually quite a small amount of time and a small amount of money finding out that something you thought was the next unicorn actually isn't. But okay, now you've learned something. Now, what are you going to do the next time? Are you going to just run a similar MVP, or are you going to go and build the whole thing out first and waste all the money? Because I can guarantee you, second time around, you will be MVP all the way. And I heard a great stat as well. And it actually opened my eyes first time I read it, which was if you can't create an MVP in under 6 weeks, it's not an MVP. All right. And so it gives you a real ring fence to say, stop writing code and create small features and get them out there and get them tested. Even if that's all they do, a web page with one button, and that's all it does it prove it? Yes, iterate, move on, move on, and move on. Because I think that whole function for me is where people just get caught up and tied up. And as I say, I think it's a psychology more than a software process.
There's another pitfall of taking that approach of keep building and building and building. I have a personal anecdote on this one. My wife worked for a company 6 years ago. She left, and they had a project. I won't name the company, but the project was called Project Lego. And the running joke was they kept building and stacking new bricks on top of it. Now, she was there for 6 years. She was there 6 years ago when that product, I found out it's only just finished, like now. And the biggest problem there is retention. Most of the original staff have moved on since that project started. And now if you ask, 5 different people what it does, they'll give you 5 different answers. The focus has been completely lost. So I think when you're having this MVP, especially with startups which have a really naturally high turnover rate, right? You've got to consider this whole piece of, well, if we spend so long building it and shifting it and changing it, forget about having an ugly baby. You're going to have a twisted mutant by the end of it. Nobody knows if it's human or not.
Yeah, technically a teenager, but whatever.
I did want to go back to a point that you made, Miro, a few minutes ago about scalability. We had one point in our sales deck from 2020, which has never really gone away, which is startups having one of two linked problems: either building the MVP on a very costly final product infrastructure that takes a very long time to build, a very long time to run, or the opposite, which is completing the MVP and building the product on the MVP infrastructure that's flimsy and made of cardboard.
I'm not sure if there's a right answer to what at the end of it is the right approach. I think to me it's more around what is the smallest iteration you can do. If you end up tying yourself into a platform that doesn't scale, it's definitely going to be an issue when you've got the million users, right? But are you going to be in the same platform at that point? I'd like to think that it's probably something that you've already solved at the point. Now there are great examples of building something on a proprietary, say a proprietary database technology. Basing your product on a platform that is not designed for building products in the first place, right? And that is typically where we see the real horror stories in terms of scalability, in terms of actually there's no product here, right? We can't build a product on Excel, right? We can't build a product on something that is not designed to scale or support a product in the first place, right? So in those examples, you might end up rebuilding everything, but at the end of the day, is that such an issue, right? You've already gone through the biggest hurdle of actually finding product market fit if you have customers, right? If you end up rebuilding your product from scratch, you've already proven that it works, right? So that's not a huge issue, is it?
I agree, and I'd go back to the example of Excel. I think that there's two things I would say about it. I completely agree with the fact that it's non-scalable, but from an MVP it doesn't need to be. If you're very clearly in the mindset, I want to prove this one thing, and Excel's the easiest way for me to get there in an MVP before I spend the money to build it out, do it. Absolutely do it, but do it in the mindset, knowing that this is literally an elastoplast to prove a concept, which is exactly what an MVP is for. So it's a viable thing. But again, where you talk at one hand, people are polishing a piece of software that suddenly becomes a landscape, right? And is not an MVP. That's wrong. And in the same way, if you bring something to market that's very feature functional, and then you never upgrade it to the proper industrialized version, that's an even bigger problem in my view, because you've actually got something that's working that people want, and that you haven't removed the tech debt from it because you never realized that you just cracked on and never thought about what was going to happen next. These two things aren't exclusive of each other. You can figure these things out, and they're both viable in their own way, right? But you just got, again, it comes back to the psychology. Where's the point where you stop with your MVP code set, right, and factor your way out of it into something that's going to be more robust and more structured, irrespective of what platform it's on. I don't care if it's running off your Mac at home for an MVP purpose. It's perfectly valid if it proves that it's what's needed. The other thing is that you've got so many. There's a massive competitive marketplace out there for hosting right now. So the Googles and the Azures and the AWSs are throwing free resources at you to get you into their space, so that you can then create an account and scale it from there, which is also a valid thing if you want to do. But just time out. Is this what you need? Do you need to make that decision now? Do you need to tie your horse to that wagon right now this second? The answer is probably not. So stop wasting time thinking about platforms and scalable cloud infrastructure when you don't even have a web page for your product, right? I would think about it the other way around. And if you need a platform for it after you've built all of that, then it's very, very easy for you to get one. But again, people get caught up in it's got to be fit for purpose. Yeah, but what purpose? It's not necessarily the one that you're thinking of.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to circle back to what you said about tech depth, right? I think a fantastic way to fail spectacularly is to aim for zero technical depth, right? I guess that's another way of saying solve all the problems, right? Take no shortcuts and build everything the long and hard way, right? And fantastic if you have the budget for it and the time for it, neither of which you do as a startup or with the mentality that you should have, right?
I think even if you do have the time and the budget, it's the wrong thing to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's not bringing to market your product as soon as possible to learn from. You're building stuff that you may not need, or you build completely differently with feedback from customers. It's pointless. Oh, I'm building it once. We're writing code once. We'll reuse it everywhere. You don't need to worry about that stuff. They're great protocols, but you don't need to worry about any of that for an MVP. It makes absolutely no sense. You've got to divorce yourself from software development lifecycle as an MVP. For me, they are completely different things. And you could build an MVP that does what it says in the tin, and then start and build a software development lifecycle for your new SaaS product with one line of code from beginning to end again. And then second time around, while one is in the market and the other is starting to spin up, then you think about tech debt, then you think about plugins, then you think about everything else. But you're absolutely right. Apart from the fact I think that zero tech debt is a misnomer. It's impossible. And if you're trying to solve that problem, I think you've got bigger issues.
Absolutely. Again, one of my favorite phrases is that every line of code that you write is to varying degrees an incorrect guess on what the future looks like. Right. So everything is technical depth to varying degrees.
Yeah. And how many ways do you want to look at that statement? Because it's not just about whether or not there are versions and other bits and pieces of open source or whatever it is that you're connecting to that might need to be changed or updated or been deprecated or don't work or whatever it might be, but about the feature that you've just written it for. You've now changed that feature based on feedback. So by default, it's now technical debt, irrespective of the fact that it still works. Right, that's the bits that for me is most interesting, and I would imagine that's where the majority of tech debt comes from. Right, I don't know what you think.
Yeah, indeed. There's a on technical debt and kind of that area. Another great example of failing, not necessarily in the MVP space, but right after the MVP is just ignoring security and data protection. Right, we've seen that fail fantastically for some organizations. Right, just build what you have, keep your database open to the world, and once you do have your first 10,000 or 100,000 users, somebody goes and finds your database and downloads all their data and sells it off in the dark web. Right, so a great way to fail is to not start dealing with the technical debt, especially when it comes to things like security and things like buttoning up all your design principles for the architecture, ensuring that what you're building is actually something that is inherently secure by design. Right.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's very easy to focus on the feature functions and forget all of the peripheral stuff that is immediately important, particularly if you're not selling B2C. If you're selling B2B, it's even more important that you have to have a really clear structure and idea and strategy for it once you get through the MVP stage. But again, as we said, while you're an MVP, all bets are off within reason. Okay. But it depends, and again, on the use case that you're creating it for, or what's it for. If you're building something that's meant to be secure, then you're going to have to deliver some level of security in it. But if you're trying to prove a feature functional use case, then it's completely different. And yet there are ways to do that and anonymously taking data off the table.
So we've talked about how to build for your MVP. What about sort of how to optimize costings around the MVP cycle?
Well, there's a question. Do you need to optimize costs, right? if you're tactically trying to get your MVP out in the market, a great example of getting stuck in the weeds is to try and think of the big picture, think of the strategic end game, while actually what you need is some tactical thinking to move forward to the next milestone, right? So you can very easily start to think that, this is not going to work when we've got 1 million users. This is going to cost us 2 million a month, and we can't make it work. Well, it's not an issue when you've got 2 users, right? It's definitely going to be an issue when you have 2 million users, but you're not going to be doing the same thing that you do with 2 users as you do with 2 million users, right? So I think a great way to kind of ensure that you don't get an MVP out there is to try and think of the big picture from a cost perspective as well. Try and optimize cost when you actually don't have costs, right?
I think you're absolutely right, and I think this comes back to the MVP psychology and the MVP mindset. You're building an MVP, or you think you're building an MVP, but actually what you're doing is you're already looking at scaling it and running it as if it was a live product. And there's a massive bridge between those two things that you haven't even begun to build yet. So focus on the thing that you're doing now, right? Take all the shortcuts you need to do, make it punch above its weight in terms of how it looks, right, if you can. But fundamentally, just you're getting it out there to get the feedback. And if you've got people behind it, hand cranking, all of this stuff to get it out there, that's fine. It's absolutely fine, because the feedback is the only thing that determines what happens next. And it determines what the cost cycles might be at some point in time, because you'll have got real data. Something you think is going to be used 30 times a second is used once every 3 days. You've got a completely different way of actually implementing that. And it goes right down the priority stack in terms of having to build it now or later and what the cost cycle is going to be for it. Again, you're not clairvoyant. So stop trying to think of all of the exciting ways to deploy this when it's a 200-person, 500 million pound a year business. Because none of that's going to happen if you start to build all of this stuff out now. Because I guarantee you'll tear it down and build it with something else later on, if you're lucky enough to get that far, because you haven't run out of money.
So in your ideal situation there, Amos, you build a big wall around the MVP and keep it completely separate from the product cycle until it's finished and completed and presumably proposed.
I think I would look at it slightly differently. You're right to consider it that way from a psychological point of view. Focus on the MVP, but the MVP can have 100 iterations, and it's only on iteration 96 that actually moves out of MVP into actual production software, right? Why? Because you're iterating it based upon what you hear from customers and the feedback that you get. And the more people get exposed to it, the more feedback you get, the more valuable that feedback is. And I've heard people think about, I've produced this MVP, I've got 5 people who have told me what to develop next. These people aren't developers. So you're not listening to them about how to develop your software. What you're looking for is generic trends in feedback over time, which is why you've got to get out to as many people as possible, because what you're picking for are the trends. 8 people out of the last 30 said they don't like this button in this place. That makes sense, right? Then you can go and do something like it. You're not asking how to program your software, but what it means is that the innovation that's being created and the iteration of your MVP, again, in small, subtle steps, you're fixing 1 or 2 things at a time and releasing it and letting people know. That means your wall, if you like, is expanding and getting wider, but it's still an MVP, right? Only when you get to a certain point, and you'll know what that is, are you over that wall and into production territory. And of course, the rules change then, but you know this, right? You know this because you've been in an MVP mindset, and everything up until now has been tactical to get to a certain point on the map, a certain critical milestone. And now you can start to deliver something that's going to change and maybe go into a lot more of a product roadmap orientation, because you've got the real understanding from your customers that that's what they want, and you're on steady ground. It's not just coming out to the back of your mind about what you think they want. This is what you know they want. And so you're being very, very optimal and efficient with what you're building. And then you need an architecture and an infrastructure underneath that to support it and keep it secure. Well, that makes sense. That's okay. But it kind of expands your concept of the wall into something that's ever expanding. But your mindset around the MVP is still the same psychological constraint, because that's how it should be. And it could still fail right up until that point. And that's really the way to look at it. And if it does, you've spent the optimal amount of money, the minimum amount of money and time on it, and you've learned an awful lot, and you go to then either pivot it and go do something else.
There's another great example on exactly what you said about post MVP, and it's got to do with focus and strategy for the product, right? Another great way to fail is post MVP. Say you've got 5 paying customers with your product, right? And you built the feedback loops to understand what your customers want, but all of your 5 customers want different things, right? You've got 5 different directions to take your product, and you do them all, right? There's a fantastic way to fail right after MVP, where you do 5 forks of your product and start pursuing every single paying customer from your pool, right? Keep everyone happy, make sure that you can deliver everything that's required, and just purely blindly follow every single paying customer. I think that's we've got great examples of that happening as well, don't we?
Yeah, I've definitely seen that before. Because people, when you speak to customers, you hate saying no. But they don't know that they really want something. It just might make their life a little bit easier. Well, we're not really here to make their life easier, right? We want to give them something that's functional and that works. And if it's something all of your customers want, great, then that's how it gets deployed, right? But you've got to keep an eye on both things. And maybe out of that 5, there might be one of them that's a really valid thing to do that you hadn't already thought of. The other 4 probably aren't.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you do go down that route, there's a clear path of following the money, right? If you've got a big customer who's willing to pay for the fact that you're going to have to spin up all of these extra processes and all of these extra sets of infrastructure to support them, great, do it, right? But a great way of failing in that is underestimating what's actually required for you to be able to support multiple product roadmaps, multiple directions of travel at the same time.
Completely agree.
Yeah. And in the spirit of anthropomorphizing our MVP, would that make it a Hydra? 5 different heads all have to be fed?
I think it would, yeah.
5 startups.
Brilliant. Okay, well that's great. I think we'll leave it there then. Thank you both very much for your insights. Are there any horror stories that you'd like to share just before we sign off? Anything in particular come to mind?
I guess the closest I could get to with it is an MVP that ended up being a monolith application on a hobbyist compiler that ended up going into production with somewhere in the region of 500,000 users, right? And it became an unbearable, unmanageable nightmare in terms of software deployment, software release, and software upgrade. And even though it made money, which is great, it was a very unhappy place to support and to manage. Right? Why? Because it didn't have that stepped functional deployment environment. And again, as a monolithic piece of software, it meant that you were releasing one code set for the entire database. So every time you did that, we had to basically retrospectively test every feature function. And of course, that didn't happen, which meant that something that you've just released is now broken something else over here that you didn't even know was related to it. So it became extremely complicated and very difficult to do.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you both very much. Really, really good chat. Looking forward to doing a part 2 now that we've washed away all the negativity about what to do right when building an MVP as a lean startup. But we'll save that conversation for another day. If you'd like to register for the podcast, you can find us at release.works/podcast. We're also on YouTube, Spotify, and RSS, where all good podcasts be found. Gentlemen, thank you both very much.
Pleasure. Thank you
Very much.